Hello and welcome to the EU AI Act podcast, your go-to resource for understanding the European Union's legislation on artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Mark Kelly, and I'll be your guide through this intricate landscape of AI regulations that could shape the future of technology in Europe and beyond. In each episode, we'll delve into the EU AI Act, exploring its purpose, implications, and the roles of those involved. From AI developers to deployers, our mission is to demystify how this groundbreaking regulation impacts everything from high-risk AI systems to everyday applications that influence both the physical and virtual realms. Whether you're a developer, deployer, or simply curious about the future AI, this podcast will equip you with the insights and knowledge needed to navigate the ever-evolving world of AI regulations. Stay tuned as we explore these topics and more, helping you to stay informed and ahead in the rapidly changing field of artificial intelligence. Don't forget to subscribe to the EU AI Act podcast on your favourite streaming platform to never miss an episode. Hello everyone, it is Mark Kelly here. I hope you're doing really well wherever you are. Today, as part of our EU AI Act podcast, I'm very happy to welcome Sebastian Hallensleben, who is the chair of EU AI Standardization, Send-Elect JTC 21. Sebastian, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today. I think it'd be very helpful for the listeners if you give a little bit of an overview in your role as the chair of EU AI Standardization, Send-Elect JTC 21. Bit of a mouthful. If you could tell me a little bit more of an overview about what that is, what does it look to try to achieve, and the impact, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark, for having me on your podcast. And indeed, it does require a little bit of explanation, and hopefully through this podcast, your listeners will get a better idea of what standardization actually does. Everyone knows and talks about the AI Act, but the AI Act is a piece of regulation. And if you look into this regulation and you try to make sense of what you actually need to do, you'll start to struggle quite quickly. Because the AI Act, for example, might say, well, for certain applications, your AI system needs to be transparent, or it needs to keep records, or it needs to be privacy protecting. But the AI Act doesn't really say what this means or how to go about it. And this is not any deficiency in the regulation or any oversight or laziness on the part of the legislators. It's rather by design. There is a thing called New Legislative Framework, which outlines the synergy between regulation that sets those high-level requirements and objectives on one hand, and on the other hand, there is standardization that defines all those details, a path towards compliance, a way of, for example, describing what transparency is and how to achieve it and how to measure it. So regulation and standardization go hand in hand. And now that the AI Act is finalized, we are halfway through creating all those detailed standards. And for most organizations, and probably most of your listeners as well, these standards will be the main thing that they read and follow rather than the regulation itself.
Wonderful explanation. Tell us about the goals of the EU AI Act in your opinion.
Well, there was a thing called the High-Level Expert Group going back to roughly 2018 that was set up by the European Commission to make sense of, well, what actually needs to be done as far as AI and Europe is concerned. And this high-level expert group, I think composed of around 50 people, came out with two tracks, if you like, or recommended two big tracks. It said, well, number one, create an ecosystem of excellence. So Europe really needs to promote AI innovation. And number two, create an ecosystem of trust. And that was really about mitigating and containing the risks posed by AI. Both two tracks are valid and important and need to be implemented. What the AI Act does, it addresses the risk mitigation, that second track. So it's not designed to promote AI innovation. I think that's one of the big misunderstandings. So yes, you can point it out, but it's not a criticism of the AI Act because it was never designed to do anything other than risk mitigation. So the AI Act is designed to make sure that the biggest risks of AI are contained. And I think what the AI Act gets right, going back to the very first draft that the Commission proposed in 2021 already, it doesn't try to regulate the technology, it tries to regulate the application, and it also follows a risk-based approach and says, well, the greater the risks, the heavier the regulation. So I think the construction was quite sensible, even though in detail there are always things that could have been different.
It's good that you mentioned that, because a lot of times there's a stick put to the EU members who are driving this through to say balancing between innovation, regulation, that delicate dance. But as you rightly said, it was never about that. It was about risk mitigation. And if you can help with the other, fantastic. However, the primary objective was to do this. What do you believe are the major obstacles to creating ethical and trustworthy AI systems today?
There are a number of obstacles. So first of all, it proved to be surprisingly easy to see a global consensus on high-level principles. So what does ethical AI actually mean? And people very quickly agreed, well, it's transparency, it's privacy protection, it's fairness, it's robustness, it's accountability, it's explainability, it's sustainability. And there was a time, again, around 2017, 18, 19, when pretty much any institution in the world published a white paper or some sort of report on ethical AI. It's maybe exaggerating a little bit, but they all more or less said the same. And regardless whether you looked at white papers from Europe or from the G20 or from UNESCO or even the Beijing AI Academy, or it's that consensus is the easy bit. But the hard bit is, well, how do you operationalize something like fairness? How do you put it into practice? How do you even measure it so that you can gauge, well, have I made any progress in making that system fairer or more transparent or more privacy protecting? And also another obstacle have been quite divergent views on the enforceability of such principles. And this is really where Europe and the US in particular take different approaches. It's obviously explained, kind of described in very broad brushes, but in Europe the perspective is very much we need to make things measurable and enforceable and supervisable from independent third parties, be they regulatory authorities or certifiers or whatever. Whereas in the US, the philosophy is more around, well, we trust companies to do the right thing. We just need to provide some input and some guidance and to encourage companies to go that path. So it's a subtle difference, but one that crops up again and again.
So when we actually look at some of the risks and ethical concerns, particularly with generative AI technologies, how do you think that would differ between, your kind of standardized AI and generative AI? I like to think of, recommendation engines, those kind of more machine learning. And then you got generative AI, which is creating, data, images, audio, video, which feels like we're in a new sport than what we've had before. How would you look at that?
It is actually a very, very fundamentally new ball game. And I would go as far as saying that generative AI is a much bigger disruption than the kind of discriminative AI, the AI that tries to make decisions or to recognize objects or do those now almost traditional AI tasks. I started looking at generative AI back in 2018 when deepfakes came out, and the technology was available and available to pretty much everyone to not only fake everything, every bit of content, but also to fake everyone and to do so at scale. And I ask myself the question, well, what does that actually do to the digital space when you can no longer trust that someone you see is actually a real human being, when you can no longer trust that what someone says is real? We obviously know that manipulating photos is something that goes back decades or even longer, and manipulating text goes back, well, probably as old as humanity. But manipulating video was something very, very new. And it's not only dangerous because it goes against our learned assumptions of what we can trust with our eyes, but also because it has a far more direct emotional impact. So even if you find out afterwards that a video clip was somehow manipulated, yeah, the emotional damage is done. The original clip has gone viral, and it's impossible to undo that damage. And in the years since 2018, initially, I spent quite a bit of time awareness raising, going around conferences, going around federal ministries in Germany. I convened a working group at the European level just to point out we have a fundamentally new challenge here. And what I loved about ChatGPT when it came out in December 2022 was, well, I no longer had to do any awareness raising because now everyone saw, yes, there really is a very, very fundamental shift happening. So in my view, the attention now needs to move towards, well, what can we do about it? And a very, very strong message, an important message, is that we will not be able to limit the downsides of generative AI by or just by regulating generative AI. And we will also not cover or address the downsides by any generative AI standards, because regulation and standards only ever reach the good actors. They never reach the bad actors. People who create fake commentary to simulate political majority, people who create thousands of fake reviews and thus make it impossible to have a functioning market, people who just flood the internet with bots, with fakes that are too good to be easily spotted, they don't care about regulation. They don't care about standards. And they are also typically in jurisdictions that we can't reach with regulation anyway. So what bothers me is that there seems to be a misconception that we just have to find the optimum regulation and the optimum set of standards for AI, and then all is good. And that's just not true. Maybe for discriminative AI, it's close, but for generative AI, it's definitely not true. And we need a very different approach there.
Which ties in nicely to my next question, because as you rightly said, generative AI became a thing within 5 days. We had 1 million users. Within 8 weeks, we had 100 million users for OpenAI. So people were using interfaces to a technology that was there before, but suddenly they got case studies and applications, and it became everyone could get access to it within majority of population, which meant that suddenly there was the applications that people went viral on they could actually to do. And it's funny, although I've been working in the world of AI for 6 years, just when that happened, everything exploded and it became a real thing. So if we look to build on the last question, how do you think that AI ethics can be effectively operationalized into actionable guidelines based on what you'd said before the challenges are to do that?
Well, you put it very well. You said, well, the awareness exploded of generative AI through that dialogue interface, because the technology was there before for several years, but it's the interface that made all the difference. In terms of what we can do, as I said, we cannot rely just on regulation and standardization. What we need to do, in my opinion, we need to think much more fundamentally about a number of questions that relate to the digital space as a whole. So number one, what does trust actually mean in the digital space? And it is an absolutely essential ingredient, both for an economy, because otherwise markets don't work without a modicum of trust, and also for societal discourse, for social interaction, for democratic discourse. So we really need to think about the workings of the digital space as a whole. And I've become convinced that we need to extend, to broaden the set of infrastructures and protocols that we have, to have protocols that allow us to track trust, to build a track record for trustworthiness, to do it in a way that is very, very individualized and decentralized, because the fact that you trust someone doesn't mean that I trust that same person and vice versa. So we never want to have a central ministry of truth or ministry of trust. It has to be individual, and we need to have those degrees of freedom. At the same time, if you trust someone, but who I don't know yet, and I trust your judgment, well, that gives me a starting point that I would maybe provisionally trust that other person as well. So we need mechanisms to share those individual assessments of trust in our neural networks. And so this is a task that goes well beyond AI regulation. It really is the fabric of the digital space that we need to consider. And maybe to add to that, I like that people promote media literacy. It's always a good thing, but it doesn't help when the fakes are too good. I like that people promote fact-checking, but fact-checking is a semi-manual process, so it's not sufficient when there's an absolute flood of automated fakes. I like that people promote detection tools, but at best it's only ever going to be an arms race with the fabrication tools, and for text it doesn't work at all because there's not enough data. And I also like that people work on watermarks, but again, this addresses a very specific niche. So all the solutions that are being discussed for the challenges posed by generative AI, in my view, are not sufficient or too narrow or not strong enough. We need that big discussion on resilience of the digital space.
Yeah, because it's kind of like a spoon and a knife fight in terms of trying to propose some of these solutions, because it's like a speedboat again in a swimming pool. It's very, very hard to control this or manage around that. So when you think about the frameworks that you'd recommend for AI risk assessments and classifications, what key advice would you offer to policymakers on AI development and deployment? Because it's such an embryonic phase. It's moving so quickly. I know, I've been in the world of tech for 17 years now, and it's not the first time somebody has said this feels different, but genuinely this does feel different.
Yes and no. One of my other hats is co-chairing the OECD expert group on AI risk and accountability. The main task there at the moment is to extend the existing responsible business conduct framework of the OECD to also cover AI governance and specifically AI risk assessment. Just for context, this is one of the few internationally binding tools that the OECD has, and currently those responsible business conduct guidelines cover things like don't bribe local officials, don't use child labor, don't completely mess up the environment, but it has an enforcement mechanism, and it actually has teeth. So, for example, the company that certified those Brazilian dams that broke hundreds of people was taken to task under that framework. But anyway, so this gets an AI extension to set a certain minimum requirements for how you do AI risk management. And we concluded very early on that there is no point creating yet another risk management framework, because there are so many risk management frameworks around already. There are some that have been there for decades, or at least for many, many years. So things like the IEC Guide 51 or the ISO 31000. There are things that are more recent and that are AI specific. So, for example, the NIST risk management framework. But if you cross-reference them and kind of try to take a slightly more big picture approach, they've all got a very, very similar structure. They've all got things around identifying risk, around managing risk, around mitigation, around governing the whole process, about deciding what are risks and non-risks. So that whole philosophy of risk management is actually not changing in any fundamental way as far as AI is concerned. So on this structural process level, I actually think that it's more, well, it's a task, it's work that needs to be done, and it needs to be done carefully and diligently, but I don't think we need a fundamentally new approach. And maybe there is also a mind shift that's necessary among some AI startups who push products into the market, assuming, well, because it contains AI, only AI regulation applies. But it's not true. If you have a robot, if you sell a robot that contains AI, of course, all the other regulations and safety rules and risk mitigation frameworks for robotics still apply, regardless of whether this is driven by some normal kind of sensor input and rule-based movements, or whether it's driven by AI. It doesn't matter. And I think the challenge is more that those worlds collide to some extent, kind of the world of software, of IT, of move fast and break things on the one hand, and on the other hand, the traditional, if you like, safety community that doesn't like to move fast and that also doesn't like to break things, because those things might be human beings or they might be expensive things. And so if you ask for the challenge, it's not about the actual risk management frameworks, it's more about those cultures having to find common ground.
When you look at some of the key challenges, but also the opportunities for AI regulation in the next decade, what do you see them playing out to be?
One of the challenges that I think is not properly addressed yet, it's recognized, but it's very hard to address, is how do you deal with AI changing once it's in use? You might test it, certify it against certain standards today, and then it just learns overnight. And so technically speaking, it's no longer certified tomorrow. So that means you probably have to automate the certification for some, or the testing and certification to some extent. And then you have to build the infrastructure for that automated test result to reliably go back to presumably the original certifier. So I think that's a new challenge that needs to be addressed, because it's no longer just a case of, well, wear and tear that of course changes behavior of machinery as well, but in this case it can change much more drastically, and we haven't got that gut feeling yet of how quickly or drastically that can happen. And I think a related challenge is, well, how do you find all the people to do a technically competent, but also, in a sense, pragmatic regulatory supervision of AI? Because all the brains are being pulled into both big tech and also into AI startups, and that's where the money is, and that's where the excitement is. So it's quite hard to find enough people to do the regulatory oversight. And this is, for example, one of the challenges faced by the AI office. It really needs to work hard to attract the really attractive talent.
Yeah, that's suddenly going to become more pressing, because you're trying to hire in to implement and to adopt these strategies. But if the talent isn't there to do it, it's going to be very, very difficult. But also from an organization perspective, they're going to have to hire in and train up to become compliant. So there's kind of like a race parallel happening at any one time. And I love the way you give that example that you can be certified, but as that training happens, that certification becomes no longer relevant, versus where you've got a QE or kind of ISO stamp, where it's the case of going, this product or service has been certified, but that's not moving. to the same extent. How do you facilitate consensus building among AI stakeholders for effective standardization? Because we saw with the EU AI Act, we saw some very, very big players saying, we've got completely different opinions, we're signing petitions, and then you're trying to get that consensus. Not to mention the harmonization of China, US, you're bringing that all together. It seems very, very far apart at the moment.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And thanks for connecting standardization to consensus building, because that's what it is at its heart. And that's also where standardization draws its legitimacy from, that it is the result of consensus building, and consensus building among all relevant stakeholders. So it's not just industry, it's also consumer interests, it's civil society, it's trade unions. So there are a whole raft of mechanisms to pull in the full spectrum of stakeholders. So maybe addressing the second part of your question first. So as far as consensus between Europe, China, and the US is concerned, that's really, to some extent, or to a large extent, a political question that goes towards cooperation versus competition, the views on a global market. And I think the fundamental differences in the paths that these three blocks, if you like, are taking are clear. China takes a view of that's very much dominated by controlling AI and also using AI for control. The US is very much dominated by kind of a commercial view of AI, and Europe is very much dominated by kind of a risk mitigation and fundamental rights protection view. It's obviously a little bit cliche, painting in very broad brushes here, but we can distinguish those three different views. And I don't think that we're going to see any merging of those views, or I don't think that any of those views will win in some sense. So we will always have these different approaches to AI. And incidentally, the European approach is not just geographically European, it's also a mindset that is, for example, shared by the AI Verify framework from Singapore, or it's shared by many of the people I speak to in Japan. The extent of that consensus is a matter of kind of politics and policy making. As far as this consensus is concerned within a standardization committee, you're perfectly right, it's hard. And for AI, it's particularly hard because the spectrum of stakeholders is so broad, because the size of the effort, so we've got 140 experts in JTC 21, we've got additional experts in national mirror committees, so almost every country that contributes has a national mirror committee. So overall, we're probably talking around between 1,000 and 2,000 experts in Europe building those standards. It's a fairly big piece of regulation. So we've got 10 different standardization request items to satisfy. And we do have very, very different interests. So the interests of big tech are very different from the interests of a European SME, or the interests of civil society, or the interests of any of the other groups that we have in JTC 21. So a number of things do help. So one is obviously the tradition of consensus building in general, things like the Harvard principle, not negotiating positions, but exchanging interests and finding common ground. So that's obviously one kind of mechanics of consensus building. The second is that the AI Act sets a political boundary. And I do have to kind of remind stakeholders in JTC 21 occasionally that we are not there to renegotiate the AI Act, to make it stricter or less strict, or to kind of change it. Of course, everyone's got opinions, including myself, but we have to keep that out of standardization. We just work within the box prescribed by policymakers. And then there is also a certain amount of pressure to come to a consensus. And this really comes from two sources. First of all, there is pressure from industry, because industry wants and needs reliable standards. Because the regulation itself is too high level, is too generic to be implemented directly. And no one wants to see a repeat of the situation after GDPR was introduced, when we had exactly that situation, just the regulation and no standards to go with it. So in this case, in the case of the AI Act, we really want those standards. Otherwise, industry is going to be very unhappy. And the second pressure really comes from a mechanism that's buried in the AI Act. There is this thing called common specifications, and that's kind of a fallback that is built into the AI Act, where if standards cannot be agreed on, if consensus cannot be reached, then the European Commission has the right to kind of, I'm kind of simplifying a bit, but to kind of create their own standards instead. That would be the acceptable, preferred way towards compliance. And I can tell people in JTC 21, well, look, you can kind of argue and not agree, which then raises the risk of the European Commission imposing something that you have no control over at all. So it's actually in your interest to come to a consensus.
Yeah, and I think it's very, very important to mention that you have now, you're working within a framework, within a box.
Yes.
You have to leave your opinions at the door, and you have to work within that, which is kind of liberating to some cases, because you just have to work with what you have. Managing between 1.5 to 2,000 different types of expert opinion, which can vary, I can only imagine. But then when you've got those kind of core 10 areas to work through and maneuver, it becomes very outcome focused, right? So you're either moving forward or you're not. And I like the way you gave that kind of Harvard example in terms of that foundation, or that kind of spirit of how to utilize it. Coming back to more of a personal question to yourself, what advice would you offer from your kind of learnings for AI leaders and people being able to work with the best intentions around this?
Depends a little bit on what you mean by AI leaders, because that's a fairly broad, broad spectrum of people.
Yeah, you may think that would be more from a technical perspective, but it's also just from, I suppose, people that want to introduce it within their business offering, either externally sell it as a commercial product, or internally, offering different products or services for their own employees, because we know that the vast majority of AI applications are for internal use now. So data retrieval, summarization, customization, HR onboarding, offboarding, customer service internally, rather than actually doing it external. So I'm quite interested in your kind of personal perspective.
Well, if you look from the application side and people who want to use AI, first thing I would say is, don't give a product a free pass just because it contains AI. Be just as demanding in wanting to see certain quality levels achieved and wanting to see proof for those quality levels beyond a glossy brochure. And that is actually surprisingly hard. So if you talk about something like recommender systems in human resources to pick candidates, it's very, very hard to prove any quality levels. What I would also say is that there are cases where using AI for something that used to be done manually, be it a selection, be it a decision or something like that, forces us to confront, well, what was actually the quality of our manual decision-making like? It's all nice and good to say, well, we want an explainable credit scoring decision from an AI system, but how explainable was the decision previously? So, or we want a clear approach from AI in an autonomous car, that infamous question, well, do you run over the child or the granny? Well, then that forces us to confront, well, how were those decisions taken previously and what is actually changing? So that would be the kind of second piece of advice, to to use AI as an opportunity to question how we approach and decide certain things. And maybe the third piece of advice that I would give is to spend some time to understand where the real disruption is. In many cases, AI is just a tool, and it just improves the behavior of something that existed previously. Be it, I don't know, the optimization of some industrial process, and whether the gas flows in a turbine are kind of optimized through some mathematical, numerical, differential equations, or whether it's being improved by AI. Well, it doesn't matter. It's just a tool to improve gas flow in a turbine and kind of get better efficiency or less noise or whatever. But in other cases, AI is truly disruptive, and it's not necessarily where people shout that it's disruptive or where you might expect it to be disruptive. But in particular with generative AI, there are quite a few pockets that I think will be changing beyond recognition in the next few years.
Yeah, it's amazing to see the change that's happened in the last 12 months. To imagine what the next 24 to 36 months are, it's truly, mind-blowing what's going to happen with that. I'm very, very excited about AI in healthcare, the opportunity to manage and utilize agents, and the ability for AI for good in general is very, very exciting. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the EU AI podcast, and I've been chatting with Sebastian Hallensleben, Chair of EU AI Standardization, Sen Sedulect JTC 21. Sebastian, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
If you're as passionate about the intersection of AI and regulation as we are, then you'll want to dive deeper. That's why I'm excited to introduce the EU AI Act online course. This comprehensive course is designed to arm you with a thorough understanding of the EU AI Act and its implications across industries. Whether you're an attorney, a compliance officer, a developer, an executive, or a regulator, this course is everything you need to navigate the complexities of AI regulations. Over 3 hours of on-demand video and 6 detailed articles of ways, all accessible forever on any device, be it your phone, tablet, or TV. Enroll today to secure unlimited access and take the first steps towards mastering the intricacies of AI regulation. Just visit courses-ai.com to get started and stay ahead of the curve and understand the impact and lead with confidence in the age of AI. Don't miss out. Your deep dive into the EU AI Act starts here.